Good evening. Tonight, I'm wearing purple. I hope you can see it's purple, in honor of one of the great, great stars of the American theater. Now, this was before television, and she never did a movie, so she is not known today, but she was Catherine Cornell, Kit Cornell, and she was, as I said, she was a great star, and she's forgotten now, and she shouldn't be. So I'm going to read a piece about her, written by Alexander Wolcott. Now, Wolcott was an American drama critic and commentator. He was a member of the Algonquin Round Table, an occasional actor and playwright. He was a dominant radio personality, and he was the inspiration for the character Sheridan Whiteside in the play The Man Who Came to Dinner, a role that he later played himself. So he's playing himself in this satire of himself. But this particular piece is entitled Miss Kitty Takes to the Road, and it is certainly about Catherine Cornell, a great and largely forgotten star of the American theater. Miss Kitty Takes to the Road. The last time I saw the divine Sarah, she was a ravaged and desiccated old woman with one leg, and the foot of that one was already in the grave. Indeed, she had only 2 months left for living, but the prospect of such an untimely taking off was never in her jaunty scheme of things. And when I went down to call upon her in that fusty and frightening museum on Boulevard Pereire, which was her home when she was in Paris, she made it clear that her thoughts were even then at play with the witching possibility of just one more farewell tour of America, that charming America, where she had always been so uncritically applauded and so handsomely paid. My French was equal to the modest task of assuring her how ravished my country would be by these glad tidings. This time, she said, she would not attempt a long tour. In the voice of one who rather hopes to be shouted down, she explained that she was now much too old for such cross-country junketing. Too old? At this suggestion, I was gallantly incredulous. Yes, young man, much too old, she continued sadly. Of course I shall play Boston and New York, and Philadelphia and Baltimore and Washington, and perhaps Buffalo and Cleveland and Detroit and Kansas City and St. Louis and Denver and San Francisco. But at my age, I cannot attempt one of those really long tours. Thus, in all seriousness, the great Bernhardt, when approaching her 80s. Hers was a viewpoint which seemed both alien and anachronistic in an era when there had come into possession of the New York stage a generation of players who regarded any departure from Broadway as penitential, and who, when induced to play 3 or 4 seacoast cities in the trial flight of a new play, would return to New York from the strain of such an exhausting expedition, quite too prostrated to speak above a whisper. But Bernhardt, like all the great men and women of the theater of her time, was a trooper. Of the younger stars now shining brightly in the theatrical firmament, only one is entitled to be called by that name. That one is Catherine Cornell. When, at the end of June, she sailed to take her well-earned rest beside the Mediterranean, she had just completed an extraordinary season. With her repertory of 3 fine plays, her company of 60 persons, to say nothing of Flush, and her special car presided over by the only bearded porter in the entire personnel of the Pullman Company, That season had taken her on a journey of more than 16,000 miles and had involved her appearance in more than 74 cities. From Waco, Texas to Portland, Maine, from Tacoma, Washington to Montgomery, Alabama, she had taken to the road with such plays as The Romeo and Juliet of Shakespeare, The Candida of Mr. Bernard Shaw, and, most popular item in her bag of tricks, The Barracks of Wimpole Street by Miss Rudolph Bézier. She had taken along as fine a troupe as she could assemble, offering the country at large considerably better entertainment than it had been offered in 20 years. She had moved through sandstorms and blizzards and cloudbursts and never failed to keep an engagement. She had come to towns where a large percentage of her eager audience had never seen a play before and were entirely unfamiliar with the idiom of the theater. She had opened up mildewed and cobwebbed opera houses, which had stood dark so long that the guy ropes broke as they swung the scenery into place. The only surviving stagehands were so ancient that their palsied hands faltered at their tasks, and outraged rats ran startled along the foot-like troughs during the performance. She had, incidentally, played to such huge and enthusiastic audiences that, by her unprecedented venture, she came home with a very considerable fortune. Stand with me in the lobby of a West Coast theater watching the line at the box office. One woman, puzzled by the price of the ticket, discovered only from the ticket seller himself that this is a cast of real flesh and blood actors who have come by train instead of by parcel post. At such a dazzling prospect, she is beside herself with excitement. She has never seen a real play before. Behind her in line is a small boy who wants to know how many bread coupons you must collect before you can get a ticket. I know not in what heathenish school of entertainment he has been brought up. Behind him, a woman is hesitant because the seats offered her are so far forward. She is afraid the flicker will disturb her. When you play 74 cities in a season, you can count on finding theaters in only a few of them, and some of those will be old opera houses so neglected that the star must give up her dream of hot water with which to remove her makeup, huddling as best she may in a community cubbyhole which has not been cleaned, well, since last it was occupied by the late Saul Smith Russell. If no theater is still left standing, she must dispossess a movie or make shift in a community hall or a high school auditorium. In Oakland, she must share the space with the local basketball team, and through the thin partition dividing the sheep from the goats, endure with what philosophy she can muster the pistol shots of the timekeeper on the other side of the dividing wall. Strange, anachronistic gunfire sounding faintly through the swordplay which finishes Mercutio. In Memphis, she must play in a temple built by a river captain who retired from the Mississippi, got religion, and left as his memorial a huge auditorium which seats, in pews, a vastly profitable number of drama lovers. Some of them so advantageously placed that by a little craning of their Tennessee necks, they can see over the top of the inadequate curtains the hastily improvised dressing room in which Robert Browning, or Romeo, is emerging shyly from his underclothes. Such merely physical inconveniences lent a touch of salt to the eternal adventure of pitching one's booth in the marketplace. But there remains now in the path of any touring company one obstacle which only this generation has encountered. It is a commonplace that the celluloid drama has driven the flesh and blood companies from the one-night stands. But are you also aware that the local interests thus engaged are now stubbornly united in an instinctive conspiracy to keep such ancient rivals out of town? Frankly, the movie houses do not welcome the advent of such a challenge as Catherine Cornell. And in one frustrated city, not a stone's throw from the Great Lakes, they pay the only feasible stage so much a month not to book any plays in the town at all. In 100 American cities, the local movie houses would not let a play be booked on any of their stages. I could name a dozen where they prevented Miss Cornell from playing in their town at all. The viewpoint of the local management is reasonable enough. The petty lord of a movie house in which she might rear her scenery and play her play could make way for her easily enough, and with a little rehearsal even teach its elegantly caparisons ushers the lost art of seating an audience, the forgotten meaning of a reserved seat. But all his colleagues would regard him as a traitor to the common cause, and he himself, after he had collected his momentarily gratifying share of her enormous receipts, would discover that the neighborhood must have been stinting itself to pay the exceptional price of her entertainment. At all events, he finds that when he then books a film to follow her, his dependable clientele has spent all its money, and his receipts for days to come are so lean that in the end he is no better off for having passed that way. Many of that troupe's experiences during the tour they will none of them ever want to forget. They will long remember, I suppose, the leisurely progress from Columbus to Louisville, some of the players making the jump by water, moving serenely down the Ohio, taking their ease in the rocking chairs on the deck of perhaps the only riverboat in the world which is captained by a woman. They will long remember the performance at Amarillo, where a sandstorm competed so successfully for the attention of the audience that in the tender colloquies between Elizabeth Barrett and Robert Browning, neither could hear a word the other was saying. And under the deafening cannonade upon the roof fell back upon the ancient art of dumb show. And surely no one in that troupe will forget while he lives the Christmas they spent together in 1933. Christmas Eve, it was a Sunday, you remember, found them trundling through Montana. They were booked to begin a week's engagement in Seattle, and you may be sure that Mr. McClintock had joined the troupe in St. Paul to witness his great lady's triumph in his hometown. All that Sunday there had been prodigious preparation in the purlieus of the dining car. The mere members of the public who were traveling on that train were notified to dine early, as the diner had been preempted from 8:30 on. Miss Cornell was giving a Christmas dinner for her company. The whole troupe, actors, electricians, everybody. There was immense hilarity, with young Marchbanks from Canada cracking nuts for Juliet's nurse, while Robert Browning and the hated Mr. Barrett of Wimpole Street drank to each other's everlasting prosperity in thick railway tumblers of Christmas punch. But even as the last toasts were drunk, and the troupe scattered to their berths with much wishing of Merry Christmas and quotations from Tiny Tim, the management was growing uneasy because of telegraphed reports from the December rains were making transit through the state of Washington slow, perilous, and incalculable. It had already rained for 3 and 20 days and nights. And if it kept up much longer, they might have to have the rest of the trip in an ark and give their show, if at all, on the first convenient Ararat. At best, they would be later than they had hoped to be in reaching Seattle. After they passed Spokane, it began to be doubtful whether they would get there at all. At every pause, a telegram would come on board with anxious inquiries from the worried management ahead. The tickets had all been sold for the first performance. Even if the company could not arrive at the appointed time, would the management be justified in sending out word over the radio and catching the evening papers with an announcement that, however late, the troupe would at least arrive in time to give the performance at the scheduled hour? Then, as night fell, they were still proceeding at a snail's pace through rain-drenched darkness far from Seattle. The anxiety shifted to the question whether, even if the curtain could not be set up as advertised, would they at least be there in time to make it worthwhile holding the audience 15 minutes or half an hour? 7 o'clock, 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock passed, and still they crawled through the darkness, stopping even at one point, while hastily mobilized bands of railroad workers flung up a new trestle over which the train might creep breathless past the wreckage of one which had given way. By this time, the company had given up hope. There could be no performance. This meant that on the following Saturday night, 1/8 would be missing from each salary envelope. It is a rule of the theater that such deductions can be made whenever a performance is called off through what is blasphemously known as an act of God. It was, therefore, a gloomy bunch of thespians who rode the last stretch, their noses glued to the streaming window panes, as the train seemed to crawl over a bridge made of the very faces of the railroad workers who stood aside to let it pass. Grim, rain-drenched faces lit up in the darkness by the flare of acetylene torches, staring in cold, frightening wonder at the perilous passage of these strangers whose necessity had brought them out to work in the night and the rain. It was an exhausted and disgruntled troupe that finally climbed down on the platform in Seattle at 11:15 p.m. They were just collecting their wits and their baggage when they were pounced upon and galvanized into immediate action by an astonishing piece of news. The audience was still waiting. All the best trucks in Seattle were assembled at the station to grab the scenery and costume trunks and rush them to the theater. Tarpaulins were stretched, and 100 umbrellas proffered to protect it as it was being put onto the trucks and taken out at the other end. A line of automobiles were waiting to carry the company to the stage door. At the theater, or loitering in groups in the lobby of the Olympic Hotel across the street, 1,200 people were still waiting. Most of them were in evening dress, and some of them were sustaining themselves with light midnight snacks. They had waited so long. Would Miss Cornell still play for them? Would she? But the company must have time to unpack their trunks, put on their makeup, and get into the crinolines and gay, shapely pantaloons of 1855. They promised to do it in record time. Meanwhile, it seemed a pity to ask the audience to wait any longer with no entertainment of any kind. So for once in the history of the theater, the curtain was rung up forthwith, and that Seattle gathering at midnight on Christmas Day actually saw the stage set and lighted. Set, saw swung into place the walls of the Victorian prison in which the tyrant of Wimpole Street shamed his frail and gifted Andromeda. Each feat of the stagehands received rounds of applause. As the windowed wall of Elizabeth Barrett's room fell into place before the distant canvas glimpses of Wimpole Street, and the windows in turn were hung with the rich portieres and valances of yesteryear, the enthusiasm mounted. It grew as the trunks, in full view of the audience, were opened and the costumes doled out by the wardrobe mistress. The actors, in dripping raincoats and horn-rimmed spectacles, lined up like charity boys at a handout, each collecting his ecru pantaloons, his flowered waistcoat, his ruffled shirt, and whatnot. There was a great round of applause for one member of the troupe who was already in complete costume when he arrived at the theater. Flush, the guileful and engaging Cocker Spaniel, who has never missed a performance of the Barretts of Wimpole Street since the first one in Detroit some years ago. But the greatest interest of all, I think, attached to the mysterious and intricate process by which a stage is lighted, a carefully calculated crossplay of beams by which certain parts of the stage are bathed in radiance, and others, in which the action will be less important, are left in shadow. The focal point of the Barretts of Wimpole Street is the couch upon which Robert Browning rescues the sleeping princess. As Elizabeth Barrett, Miss Cornell must spend the entire first act, probably the longest act in all dramatic literature, supine upon that couch. And it is a matter for very careful calculation to have the lights which play upon it adjusted to the fraction of an inch. For this purpose, to the rapture of Seattle, Jimmy Vincent, the stage manager, stretched himself out and assumed, one after another, all the postures he knew Miss Cornell would later assume. As Mr. Vincent is stocky and oriental in appearance, and as the visible gap between his trousers and his waistcoat widened horrifically with every languorous pose in which he tried to fling his arms and head, the effect was stupefying. Then the warning bell rang. The lights in the auditorium went down, and the curtain fell, only to rise again with Miss Cornell at her post on the couch. The play was ready to begin. It was 1:05 in the morning. The entire troupe, scenery, costumes, and all, had arrived in the town less than 2 hours before, and already the curtain was rising, which is probably a record for all time. The excitement, the heady compliment paid by the audience, and having waited at all, had acted like wine on the spirits of the troupe, and they gave the kind of performance one hopes for on great occasions and never gets. But at the end of the long first act, Miss Cornell was visited by a kind of delayed fatigue. A postponed weariness took possession of her. She felt she must have something, anything, if she was to go on at all over what remained of the play. To Mr. McClintock, hovering apprehensively in the offing, she merely said, "Get me an egg," and rushed to her dressing room. Into the streets of Seattle at 2:00 in the morning rushed the faithful Mr. McClintock in quest of an egg. Nothing was open except a drugstore and a lunch wagon, and the audience in its long wait had consumed every morsel of food in that part of town. There wasn't an egg to be had. The kitchens at the Olympic across the street were dark and inexorably locked. As a last desperate measure, Mr. McClintock began calling up such surviving citizens of Seattle as he had gone to school with years before. Finally, one such appeal roused someone. A sleepy voice asked who could be calling at such an hour in the morning. It was with some difficulty that he succeeded in identifying himself. You remember Guthrie? He used to live in such and such a street and used to go to school with you? Oh, yes, and then what? Well, the voice from the past faltered in its final task. Can you let me have an egg? Incidentally, she could, and did. It was 3:45 in the morning when the final curtain fell, and that blessed audience, feeling perhaps that it was too late by this time to go to bed at all, stayed to give more curtain calls than the exhausted troupe had ever heard. When the tour wound up in Brooklyn on 23 June, Miss Kitty had played to more than 500,000 of her fellow countrymen. I suppose they will all remember her, but none, I am sure, more fondly than the faithful band in Seattle, which, on the day after Christmas, waited until 1 in the morning for her first curtain to rise. They will ever have a welcoming round of applause to greet her entrance when she is an old actress, playing the nurse to the Juliet of some youngster as yet unthought of. Alexander Wolcott. Miss Kitty takes to the road. Make sure. Yeah, Miss Kitty takes to the road. It's another era, another time completely. And it's good to be reminded of it when we look at today's grumps and grumbles and carryings on. To remember what a trooper was. And Miss Kitty, Miss Catherine Cornell, was certainly a trooper. So, in homage to her, royal for purple for royal theater royalty is what I'm trying to say. Purple for theater royalty. Miss Kitty, bless your heart. All right, that is it for tonight's Tales and Cocktails. I hope you'll be with me next week, my dears. Oh, it's exciting. Anyway, yes, thank you so much, and I will see you next week, I hope. Good night.